Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Wednesday webinar series, Lunch with the Birds. My name is Amanda Duran. I'm the program coordinator for the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative. If this is your first time joining us for our series, welcome, or welcome back if you are joining us again. And for those of you that are new, the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative is a partnership of about 100 different organizations here in Ohio that support bird conservation. And it's through our outreach committee that we're able to bring you these monthly webinars on a variety of different bird and conservation related topics. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted to our website, which the two addresses are listed there. The top website is our Lunch with the Birds page, where you can register for upcoming webinars and view a list of our past webinars. And the second site is our YouTube channel, which is where all the videos of our past webinars are posted. And I have some topics there of some of our previous webinars that are currently posted at our YouTube site. So I invite you to check those out. And we're always looking for ideas for new topics. So if you have any ideas, you can go ahead and visit our website, and there's a contact tab there, so that'll come right to me if you have any suggestions for topics that you would like to see in the future. Our topic for next month is Seeing the World Through Birds' Eyes, Understanding Avian Vision to Become a Better Birder. And that will be presented by Casey Tucker. And it'll be April 15th. That's again a Wednesday at 12 p.m. and it'll last until about 1 p.m. And registration is not currently open for that presentation just yet, but I will send out the opportunity to register for that webinar with the recording from this webinar, hopefully by the end of this week, but if not, then early next week. So with that, I would like to introduce our presenter today, Tom Bartlett, who is a master bird bander. Tom has over 44 years of birding experience in Ohio, including bird banding experience running banding stations at Springville Marsh State Nature Preserve, the Lake Erie Islands, and Winus Point Shooting Club. He is a member and officer of numerous birding and conservation organizations, and he has served on the Ohio Bird Records Committee. Tom was a field editor for the Ohio Cardinal for many years. He has published numerous scientific and general birding articles, and has written a book on birds of Seneca County, Ohio. Tom is now a retired secondary school instructor of biological sciences, and I'm thrilled to have him here with me today. So with that, I'm going to bring up Tom's presentation, but with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tom.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody hears me all right. Here we go. We got a title, which you already know. Normally with this slide, I use a pointer to show where my banding sites are. I've used those to explain what bird banding is and how it's being used. So if I take a look at this, I have banding stations on North Bass, which is way up at the very top. You can see the yellow line, which shows Canada. Healy Island is just east of it. We have one on Middle Bass. We have one on South Bass. I have a couple of them on Kelly's Island. We band shorebirds around the Sandusky Bay area and Audubon National Wildlife Refuge. And then if you see that 23 down there at the bottom, right behind that is Springville Marsh State Nature Preserve. And I have run a banding station there since 1983. So we got, whoops, I think I went too far. No, I didn't. There we go. So there's your Springville Marsh. If you've never been there, it's got a boardwalk that's almost a kilometer in length with a tower and a blind on it. It's worth the walk. It's a neat little place. I would suggest coming in late July, August, or September because it is a fen, and a lot of the flowers that you would be looking at come into bloom at that time. You get there next week, and it's pretty dead. But we're catching a lot of birds. We started banding there last Sunday. Here's Springville Marsh from the air, and you can see that it was at one time called Big Spring Prairie. It ran 8 miles northeast to the northwest, and then bent around to the west about a mile and a half, and then went southwest for about 3 miles. This is all a sedge area, and so you can see the black soil if you're looking at the side of the railroad tracks here. They couldn't drain it all, and so now it's a nice state nature preserve. Here are the islands again. You get a better look at what we're doing over there. I was on Kelly's Island last week. I'll be there tomorrow doing some work. This time of year, you got to fly over. The rest of the year, you take ferries everywhere except North Bass. And in North Bass, we have to take a private boat to get over there. Oops, nothing's moving. There we go. All of these areas that we work in are important bird areas, and I'm hoping everybody's familiar with important bird areas, but it was promoted by the National Audubon Society years ago, and it came from BirdLife International, I believe, originally, and it was to recognize areas around the world that are important to birds, whether it be for nesting, migrating, wintering, and hopefully it gives it some safety net features. If somebody comes in and tries to destroy it, you can say, hey, this has a unique significance. And a lot of my banding records go towards these sites, and several of them were declared important bird areas because of the banding. So what is bird banding? Essentially, we're going to put a band on a bird's leg, and in most cases that's an aluminum band. Sometimes it's made out of other metals. I use stainless steel on shorebirds because aluminum in salt water tends to break down pretty quick. So we also use stainless steel on cardinals because they have super strong bills and they could actually tear the aluminum band off. So and the U.S. Geological Survey currently houses the bird banding laboratory, and they send us the bands. Everything else you see at a banding station is supplied by the banders or the organization that set it up. The only thing that comes from the government are the bands themselves. Another organization that I'm very actively involved in is called the North American Banding Council, and this was set up back in around 1999. A lot of scientific organizations that use bird banding as a tool, such as the American Ornithologists Union, the Wilson Ornithological Society, Inland Bird Banding, Eastern Bird Banding, Western Bird Banding, organizations like that wanted to standardize practices and the way we collect data and the way we train people to capture and band birds. And so if you go to their website there, you can see the manuals that they produced, which would be a first step if you ever thought you were going to get into bird banding or you had a student that was going to get into bird banding. Anybody that comes to my station and wants to learn, the first step is to start reading these manuals and then show up on a regular basis and watch what's going on. It takes a little bit of time. Here's the range of the bands that I use. There's actually a band larger than that, but you can see the one on the left is a hummingbird band. Those come to me on a sheet. I have to actually cut them out, file them down, and cut them off to the size that we use. Luckily in Ohio, we usually only have one hummingbird, and that's the ruby throat. Occasionally you could get a rufous, which actually would take a little bit bigger band, so I don't deal with those. I only have one, and this makes it easy. Although sometimes with the males, I have to trim the ones I've already made because they're too loose for them. The one on the right is a size 8, and that would go on like a great horned owl or a large red-tailed hawk. You could put it on a great blue heron. It's called a lock-on band, so it's a special way to put it on. You can see the back part of it has to be curled down over the top because great horned owls and hawks could easily tear it off otherwise. On the band is an 8 or a 9-digit number, such as the one you see there, 2231-23479. And then it'll also say advised bird band, Washington, D.C. So if you have found a dead bird and you took the band off it, put it in an envelope and said, hey, I found this bird in my yard, and you gave them your address and your name and put it in the envelope, put a stamp on it, and just said bird band, Washington, D.C., it would get to the banding lab. Then a few years ago, they started putting 800 numbers on the bands, and that's still there. Now they're putting a web page on the band. In fact, there's 2 web pages where you could go and report that. The nice thing about the web page now, if you go to reportband.gov and you type in all that information, if the data's in the computer, boom, up it comes, and you know exactly where that bird was originally banded, who banded it, how old it was, and other data that was collected on it, and you can print out your own certificate of thanks and get all that information. And then a couple days later, I would get an email on the computer, and it would tell me, you found my bird, and if I wanted to, I could contact you, and we could explain what was going on. So here's the sizes. I have all these bands in my possession. There's actually a 9, a larger one, which would go on a bald eagle, and it's a riveted band. They put them on some of the swans. My permit doesn't allow for bald eagles, so I don't worry about those bands. I'm not sure I would want to. A lot of work in that. Here's some of the tools. You need various pliers to open up the bands, put the bands on the bird. You're going to measure. You're going to weigh. The thing in the top right is a leg gauge because you want to make sure the band you put on the bird is the proper size. You don't want it coming off And you don't want it too tight that it restricts things, so you use a leg gauge. Here we are banding a song sparrow. You can see you got a special tool there, which will bring that band around. You open the band up, put it in the end of that pair of plier, and then you can crimp it down on the bird's leg, and the two ends of the band come together, and the band spins around easily. Some of the data collection we do would be wing chord. We're measuring the bent wing to the tip of the longest primary. Sometimes this helps you identify species. Sometimes it helps you identify sexes. It's a piece of data that most birders collect. We also weigh birds. There's other data I'll show you in a few minutes that's going on, but this is what you're seeing here. Here's a rufous-sided towhee, or for those more up-to-date, an Eastern towhee. I like rufous-sided better. You can see this is a banding table where we're in the process of banding a bird, and the scribe here is recording all the information that I give him. And scribe is probably one of the most important things. You know, sometimes in my old age I don't see too clearly, and I say, hey, we got a song sparrow here that weighs 1.5 pounds. He recognizes that 1.5 pounds is a little bit large for a song sparrow, so I may have the wrong bird in my hand. Whoops. There we go. Here's the types of information that can be collected. Excuse me. Everything in red, I hope you see color, is required by the bird banding lab. I have to send that in at the end of the year. The stuff in blue is what most bird banders collect on their birds. And then the stuff in black depends on the species you're working on or the situation. You may collect that data. So you got species name. You have to be able to identify the bird, or that's going to be useless. You got to put down the time and the date you banded the bird, where you banded the bird, and then you age the bird and you sex the bird if possible. We take the wing chord and weight. We've mentioned that. Tarsal length, you would use a caliper or ruler to measure the tarsus. Tail length, sometimes we do that, especially like with chickadees. Where I banded Springbill, we're in an overlap area where we get Carolina and blackcap. And so the only way to separate them is using a chart that shows you the difference between the wing chord and the tail length. Coleman is the length of the bill, and there's a couple different measurements there that we can use. We use that a lot in shorebirds. CP and BP. CP is cloacal protuberance, which would tell me that I have a male, and BP would be a brood patch, which would tell me a female on some species. You know, on some species, the males actually brood the eggs, and so they would show a brood patch. Then you go through plumage and molt. You keep that kind of data. You check for fat. Tells you a little bit about the condition of the birds. For example, the other day at Springbill, we banded 77 birds, and I'd say the average fat on a scale of 1 to 6 that we use was between a 3 and a 4. So these birds are fattening up now at the end of the winter, and they're ready to head north. Most of the birds we got were sparrows, and they don't stick around. Song sparrows stick around, but we had a lot of tree sparrows, which are headed to the tundra. A lot of juncos, which are headed to the boreal forest. And condition, just general condition. You know, sometimes you can tell whether the bird's got an injury, or whether it's not looking good, or whether it's real thin. We keep all that information. Subspecies, if we know that, we'll record that. Abnormalities, and you'll see we're finding a lot of abnormalities. Birds are remarkable in their ability to survive, and when you see some of the pictures later on of what we find, you'll be amazed. The bander, the person that puts the band on the leg, we keep that data. The extractor, the person that took the bird out of the net, I like to keep that. Because if I find I'm getting a lot of injuries or some problems with birds, I want to know who needs to be retrained or who needs to be whatever. And then the net, what net the bird came out of. You know, if we find a net that's not catching birds week after week after week, there's no sense putting it up. So we may want to move it to a new location. You like to keep your nets in the same place year after year after year. And at Springbill, this is our 32nd year, and the nets are pretty well set. Ossification is looking at the skull, and you'll see a picture of that later on. But that helps you age. We use that a little bit in the fall. Now, I don't use ossification a lot myself because it involves wetting the head of the bird and moving the feathers around and looking under light. And a lot of times you can age a bird just by looking at the plumage and the molt limits that are going on. Here are the aging codes we use. We'll call, if you come to a banding station, and you're always welcome at my banding station, I might say hatch year, or HY, means the bird was hatched in the current year. Now, I can tell you right now, I'm not using that code probably for another 2 months. I do know that there are some eagles that have already hatched. I know there's some great horned owls that are already hatched, but for the most part, I won't be using that right now. After hatch year means it didn't hatch in 2015, it hatched before 2015. So it's a very general term, but it's one you use a lot. Second year, I can tell by either the plumage or maybe looking at the skull that the bird hatched in 2014. And TY, the bird hatched in 2013. Or ASY, I know it didn't hatch in 2015, and I know it didn't hatch in 2014, so it's at least 2013 or older, and then sometimes you just can't tell, and so you go with a U. Oops, back here. I don't know whether you can see this, but this is a skull, and you can see right here, see this pink? Oh, I'm moving this on the screen and you can't see it. So, but if you look at the top, you'll see some pink, and then as you come down through the skull, you'll see the white. The white is actually the skull that's ossified, but it's not totally ossified. So if I caught this bird today, I would know that that bird hatched in 2014. Because if it was an adult bird that was at least a year old, everything would be white. And what I prefer to use are molt limits. This is the wing of a black-throated blue warbler, and if you look in the secondaries, up at the top, you'll see they're black, they're white-tipped, and they're edged in blue. But then you look at the primary secondaries, and they're all a dull gray color. That tells me that's a young bird. So if I caught that bird in September, it would be a hatch-year bird. If I caught it today, it would be a second-year bird, because all the birds have a birthday on January 1st, according to the banding lab. So we can use molt a lot to help us do this. And in woodpeckers, sometimes in those primary coverts, you can see 2 generations. So you could go to a woodpecker and age it to 3 years. And sometimes you can see 3 generations, so you could call it 4 years. And we'll show you some of those in a bit. Here's indigo bunting. Both on the same day, obviously, because they're right there. But if you look at the primary coverts on the one on the left, I hope you can see this, you can see they're edged in blue. But the one on the top, on the right, they're all dull gray. Both of those birds look almost alike, but by looking at the molt limit, you can tell that the one is an SY bird. It hatched, if I was today, it hatched in 2014. The other one hatched in 2013 or before, because it takes 2 years to get to that. And most second-year birds don't look this blue, as you'll see later on. Here's a northern saw-whet owl, and I don't know whether you can see this very easily, but if you look at these primary feathers, you can see there are 3 different colors of brown in there. So I know that this bird is at least 3 years old, because he's got 3 generations of feathers in there. Here's the tail of a Philadelphia vireo, and there's 2 things that tell me that this is a young bird. The goal of a young bird at any point is to get out of the nest, and so they don't waste a lot of time producing good feathers. They grow feathers quickly, and they're not as nice and in good condition as the feathers of an adult bird. And so what happens is they wear fast. So if you look at the tail feathers of a bird in the fall, if the tail feathers are sharply pointed, that tells me it's a young bird. Also, if you see a growth bar like this, you can see going all the way across the bottom there, that growth bar is fairly even, which means all of those feathers came in at the same time. And the only time in a bird's life when all the feathers come in at the same time is when it's first hatched and getting ready to leave the nest. Every year after that, there will be a sequential molt. It'll molt the outer tail feathers and start to grow them back, and then it'll molt the next in feather and try to grow it back. And so there would be a stair-step effect if this was an adult bird. Here's a hermit thrush, and you can see on the coverts above the wing, there are little white tips to them. On an adult bird, that wouldn't happen. So even today, if you see a hermit thrush, if you can see those little white tips, you know that hermit thrush was hatched in 2014. Sometimes the job is real easy. The birds just fly in and land on your equipment and wait to get banded. And if you believe that, and then they're very patient. The one on the right is the female. The one on the left is the male. A lot of times saw-whets are very tame. And so when we're done banding them, I just set them down there, and they'll sit there for half hour, 45 minutes, or they'll fly straight up over my head and sit in a tree, and they've sat there for 2 or 3 hours and then finally drifted off. So it's kind of neat. Although in the last few years, I don't know whether I got a reputation or not, they're becoming more biters, and they've been clawing me a lot. There are a number of ways to capture birds. You can use traps like a walk-in trap or a box trap. We use mainly nets, which are fine. They're called mist nets. They're very fine. Most of my nets are 12 meters long. They're about 10 feet high. And as you can see, looking down the boardwalk, they're very, very faint. That's why they call them mist nets. Here's what the bird sees. Everything you see in that picture is covered by net. You could not walk into that shrubbery right there. But there are 4 tiers in this net. And between each tier, let's say there's 18 inches, but there's 24 inches of material. So when the bird flying through the woods hits that net, it falls down into a pocket that's created by that extra material. Whoops. So you get something like this. As you can see, here's a house finch in a net. Down in that material, there's a cowbird. There's a few other birds in the other net. Here's a yellow warbler. A lot of times when I give this talk, I like to talk about this female because I watched her fly into the net the day we took her out, and she had a band on her, and I had banded her 8 years earlier. Wow. And right above her was a male who was a second-year male. So if you put that in bird life, that's like an 80-year-old woman being chased by a 20-year-old guy. So she still had it after probably 8,000 miles on her wings. Extraction is probably the most important thing when you're dealing with birds and bird banding. You've got to get those birds out of the net, and you've got to do it safely so they're not injured. You don't damage their feathers, so you can get good data, release them, and hopefully someday catch them again. So it takes a long time to learn how to do this. And part of that is learning how to hold the birds properly, and there's several techniques to do that, to hold them safely. A lot of my banding is also education. And what you can see here, this is on Kelly's Island. Kelly's Island has a school, and it took me a long time. It took me 12 years before they started bringing the students out to the banding station there. And now, unfortunately, there's only one student. But at this time, when I took this picture, they came out for the whole week. Every morning, the teacher would bring them out. Wow. And we'd walk around. The extractors would take the birds out. The kids would carry the birds back and put them on the rack and help us process them and release them.
I can do it.
Okay.
That way you don't have to worry about using them.
So some of the trash birds we get, if you're into birds, it's things like the golden winged warbler, the black-throated blue warbler. Whoop, whoop. I went too fast. There we go. Blackburnian warbler, mourning warbler, Connecticut warbler, worm-eating warbler, which is, for me, unusual because a worm-eating warbler is a southern warbler. So it's an overshoot bird for us, but we get them every once in a while. Wilson's warbler. There's a rose-breasted grosbeak. This is a male. It's all black with that beautiful rose breast and white belly. The female will look more like a sparrow, and her underwing, if you hold it up on a female, will be yellow as opposed to this rose color. This is a song sparrow from Springville. It was our 20,000th bird. I don't know why I put it in, because the next one is a swamp sparrow, which is the 25,000th bird. I should have put in we have already done 35,000, and the 35,000th bird was a Lawrence's warbler. Ooh. Go look that one up. Now, here, let's get back to this guy again. This is an indigo bunting, and notice what it says, ASY, which means after second year, so the bird's at least 2 years old, and it's a male because it's nice and blue. This was taken on May 23rd, 2004. The next picture, same day, this is an SY male. Doesn't look very much like the other one, does it? So it's pretty easy to age this bird. Then you get things like Impetimax flycatchers, which are almost impossible to ID in the hand. Most birders ID them by call. Well, they rarely sing in the hand. So you got to go through a whole bunch of measurements. We're measuring wing chord, we're measuring tail, we're measuring differences between certain primaries, differences between secondaries. You plug it into a formula, and half the time you don't come up with anything anyway, but you still got to go through all of that. And then once in a while you get strange birds in your net, like a Cooper's hawk. What else we got here? This one was good for Springville Marsh. This was a spotted towhee. This is a Rocky Mountain bird. It showed up in 1995 in one of our nets. It was the first Ohio record. Now there's about a half a dozen records, and half of them are coming from banders. This is an Oregon junco. We get 1 or 2 of these a year right now. Another Rocky Mountain bird that wanders into the east in the wintertime, and we get them on their way back. The next one is a pink-sided junco, which is another western bird. It shouldn't be in Ohio, but he didn't know, showed up in our nets. Now, if you take a look at this, most people say, well, why is he holding that starling? But that isn't a starling. That's a red-winged blackbird. But there's no red. This bird should have red epaulets, and they're not there. It's melanistic, and the red color is not present. It'll be interesting to see if we ever catch it again, whether something triggered that gene to come on later in life or not, but I suspect it'll always look like this. Probably hard to nest. Here's a blue jay. Why do we put it up there? Because it has a red breast. Not all blue jays, not all birds look alike. They should, but they don't. Everyone is different in some way, and sometimes you see ends of the spectrum, like with this blue jay. Here's a gray catbird that we caught. It was a young bird. Look what's happened to that bill. Something genetic is going wrong there. You can see by looking at the plumage, that bird probably is not going to make it. But that's not my decision. We gathered our data, we put the band on the bird, we let it go. If we ever catch it again, it'll be remarkable, I'm sure. Here's a song sparrow with a crossed bill. We see crossed bills a lot now in very many species. We had one last fall in the Tennessee warbler. So here's a wood thrush with a tumor on the underside of the bill. We see that with a lot of ground-feeding birds now. The next one is a white-crowned sparrow, and at one time I thought that was another tumor, and then I was given this talk one time, and Dr. Horn at Ohio State pointed out to me that that was a tick, and I could have removed it. It was probably attached to the ear of the bird right there, and I find them a lot now. So now I carry a pair of tweezers. We can just reach up and pluck that off. That one probably fell off within a day, because you can see it's fully engorged. Here's a Cooper's hawk that was partially paralyzed. It evidently, if you look at the foot, sat on a hot wire. And that foot was all bent like that. The bird was perfectly healthy. It was coming into a feeder and got caught in our nets. He'd been eating a lot of birds, so it didn't hold him back. Here's an interesting one. This is a northern cardinal. And if you look carefully, one half is red and one half is brown. This is called a gynoandromorph. It had both sets of chromosomes. So if you looked at the right side of the bird, you had a male. If it turned around and you looked at the left, you had a female. It was the same bird. It would never have reproduced. Okay. Here's an indigo bunting. We see this a lot. They're missing a foot. Doesn't seem to hold them back. We caught this bird. It was an ASY male when we banded it. We caught it 4 more years in a row. We haven't caught it the last 2. We always hope it'll come back, but at least it lived at least 6 years before we stopped seeing it. Here's a leucistic swamp sparrow. You see a lot of this nowadays. White where there should be other colors. What do we got? Oh, then we went into some other areas. You know, all that other stuff I'd been doing for years. Now we're getting into hummingbirds and shorebirds more. Hummingbirds, as you can see, really tiny. I first sent one of my sub-permittees out to Illinois to get trained in this, and then they berated me into it, and I started doing it. As you'll see from the first slide, we had a few problems with our early bandings, but soon learned how to get them banded correctly after that. So you can see it's a tedious process to band a hummingbird. And when you're done, you got to measure the culmen, you got to measure the wing cord, sometimes you measure some of the tail feathers, and they aren't happy, as you can see from this. But we have had some 5-year-old hummingbirds coming back to Springville, so they survive. This is a shorebird, and you can see how tangled they get, and you can see why extraction is a very important skill when you're in bird banding, because it takes a while to get some of these birds out, and you want to get them out safely. This is a short-billed dowitcher. We started this about 10 years ago. Tom Kashmir of Gibsonburg and I started working on this. The first year we only banded about 300 birds. The second year we did another 500. And then Dr. Slemons at Ohio State, we were doing this at Winers Point. He was doing stuff with the ducks, looking at avian flu. And at that point, they thought avian flu might be transferred by shorebirds. So he showed up at our banding station, sampled some of our shorebirds, and then the next season, in fact, the next 2 seasons, he gave us an intern, ended up sampling over 500 shorebirds, and none of them were positive for avian flu. So shorebirds evidently are not carriers of avian flu. So here's some snipe, Wilson snipe. This is a semi-palmated plover, and you've heard that term semi-palmated because you get semi-palmated plovers and semi-palmated sandpipers. Semi-palmation has to do with the partial webbing in between the toes that you can see on this plover. Here's a red knot, a juvenile bird. We've banded a few of those. They've just declared this an endangered species now, so I've probably banded my last one unless they give me a special permit. American woodcock, very flexible bill. They're here already, by the way. Here's a marbled godwit. Look at the size of that bill. And then sometimes you get other things in the nets, and you have to wrestle with them. And this is a peregrine falcon. We have, over the last 9 years of banding shorebirds, we've caught 4 peregrine falcons. 2 were already banded, 2 we got to ban.
Look how that bird's looking at you.
I know. And look at the mud. I tripped running up to the net.
Oh.
Whoops.
I found that picture, by the way. I almost used that as your intro photo.
About 3 years ago, we got a grad student from Ohio State. This is Keith Norris. Came in and did some more work on our project, looking at what was happening to these birds while they stop in Northwest Ohio, mainly in the fall, and did some color marking with it. We put out several nice papers on that. This is a remarkable recapture we had, because this band that you can see on the leg, we caught this bird in the dark. We got back up to the banding table. I started processing it, and the scribe asked for the band number, and I read it off, and it was a 9-digit number with no hyphen. And underneath the number, it said Museum Paris.
Wow.
And we found out the bird, this was in 2010. The bird had been banded in 2003 on the Isle of Martinique by a French banding team. So they were coming through. I throw this up for Springville Marsh to show you how numbers can lie sometimes. And I use it when I'm working with students. But if you take a look at my data at Springville Marsh, this is from 84 to 2011. What would you say about the birds at Springville Marsh? Well, kids are saying, oh, the populations are going way up. Well, you can't say that. You need to get other information, such as, what was our effort? How many net hours did we have? So let's take a look at net hours. Well, our number of birds banded went up, but so did our net hours. So if we combine the two to analyze our data, let's see what's happened. Well, actually, there's a slight decline, but even that is probably not significant right there. It's been pretty stable for the last 10 years in this chart. But you look at some of the species. Swamp sparrows have declined, and they've declined greatly. The marsh has changed. There was a hydrology change at the marsh. The cattail marsh started to disappear. We've got rose and some other shrubs moving in. So swamp sparrows are declining, and for 24 years, swamp sparrow was the #1 banded bird. For the last 7 years, catbirds have been the #1 banded bird, and you can see they are increasing. And with the shrubby habitat, that's something you would expect. So using the bird banding data, we can document something changing going on in the marsh. Here's northern cardinal. You would have expected that one to go up a little bit, but it's been pretty steady. Ruby crowned kinglet is a migrant. So if you look at it, it looks like it bounces up and down, up and down. Well, for a lot of years, I was a teacher, so I couldn't band every day. So if I wasn't out there on the days when Ruby Crown went through, we had a down year. If I was out there on a day when they did go through, we had an up year. But over time, you can see there is a slight increase. They seem to be getting more and more common. This is a chart from 2008 of 4 solid owls I caught on Kelly's Island. And you can see where they came from. One came from up by Duluth, Minnesota. One came from Algonquin National Park. One came from Pennsylvania, but it had been banded 2 years earlier, so it didn't really... Oh, this is 2010 data. And here's one from Long Point. I like this one here because you can see that Long Point is on one end of Lake Erie. We're on the other. That bird was banded 47 hours before I caught it. We know by when I called the banding station and said, hey, we caught your bird, they told me, hey, we released that bird at 12:30 at night. Well, I caught it at 11:30 2 days later. So they can move. Here's some of our shorebird stuff. The orange line, these are, we've got several shorebilled dowitchers that we banned in Northwest Ohio, and they've been recovered in the Everglades area of Florida in the wintertime. The yellow one is our least sandpiper that we caught, and there's the Isle of Martinique. The green one is a semi-palmated plover that was banded in Suriname, we got it up in the marshes here at Audubon National Wildlife Refuge. This red one is a semi-palmated sandpiper that I banded in 2010, and it was recaptured twice in northwest Brazil in 2012. And it was recaptured like 3 days apart and over 100 miles apart. And there's another one we need to put on here. We had a Hudsonian godwit with a red flag with the letters AUL on it. And we found out that it had been banded in Chile and had come that far. So one of the reasons for our banding, teach an appreciation of the natural world. I love it when kids come to the marsh. We show them how to handle birds. We let them let the birds go. Normally, when you put a woodcock in somebody's hand, it explodes and is gone. This one just sat there, and you can see this young fellow didn't know what to do. I used to bring my students down. They helped with the process. They learned how to scribe, learned the different birds, learned there's more than just little brown sparrows. Here you've got grandfather in the middle with his granddaughter coming to on Kelly's Island, and you never know who's having the more fun. When I took this picture, I reached for the camera. There were actually 4 saw-whets on her arm. One had flown off, but those 3 sat around to get the picture, and then they were gone too. Here on Kelly's Island, at our owl banding station, the locals come out. And in fact, the guy in the back with the orange, in the fall, fishermen come to Kelly's Island and fish off the rocks for walleye. Well, they can hear my tape for the saw-whet owl all over the north side of the island. So now they stop to see how we're doing. And if it gets boring fishing, they come over to the banding station. This lady lives on the island. She comes around. I'm not sure she knows what to do with that bird. So I think, did I go too fast? No, I didn't. We got questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions. So if you have any questions for Tom, go ahead and enter those in the chat box. And we will try to address those as soon as we can. I'll start it off while we're waiting for some folks to enter some questions here. What do you see as the biggest advantage to banding? Like, what was the most interesting advancement that we were able to learn from banding that we wouldn't have been able to learn otherwise?
I think sometimes we don't realize how common birds are, like ovenbirds in the fall. You know, you never see them because they're not singing, they come through, but yet we'll have a day where we will catch 7 of them, you know, and we only have maybe 15 nets out.
Right.
So it tells us that birds are a lot more common than we actually realize sometimes. And it also tells us some birds are coming through that we didn't realize were here.
Interesting.
And one of the things we're finding with the shorebirds is, I guess I didn't see that chart in there, we measured the weight and we had a lot of recapture. And we found that shorebirds in northwest Ohio increase body weight 3% a day.
Wow.
And they spend up to 2 to 3 weeks in northwest Ohio in the fall. And if you think about it, it sort of makes sense. They're nesting in the tundra. They fly 1,000, 1,500 miles to northwest Ohio. They land in our marshes. They feed, fatten up, and then they're going to fly to either Chesapeake Bay or the Gulf of Mexico, and then they're on to South America. So this is one of the most important areas for birds, especially shorebirds in migration in the fall, because this is the only place they're going to feed. There's no other place for them to stop once they leave here.
So if folks are interested in coming out and seeing you band, where can they do that this year and when about?
We band once a week at Springville, starting last week, and we'll go into November. We will be on Kelly's Island in April for a week, in May for a week, in September for a week, and from mid-October towards the end of November, we'll be there doing songbirds and the owls. I also band on South Bass for a couple of weeks, the first 2 weeks of May. We band on Middle Bass the 4th week of April and the 4th week of September. So just send me an email and I can send you a schedule, and anytime you want to show up, you're more than welcome to show up.
All right, great. Well, I'll put your email on here so that people can contact you if they're interested. We do have a question coming in. Other than checking out the materials online at the North American Banding website, what do you recommend someone do to pursue a banding permit?
Well, first thing I would say, volunteer at a banding station and learn all this stuff hands-on. At Springville Marsh or my banding station, you volunteer and you have to watch for 24 hours, which usually works out to about 4 or 5 days, seeing all the stuff that's going on, the ways the birds get caught, how the the trained people are getting these birds out, and then you would go with a trained extractor and start working your way up through that. And then over time, you could end up abandoning the birds, aging and sexing, and all of that. But volunteering at a station would probably be the best thing. And then in order to get your permit, you're going to have some kind of a project, some kind of reason for putting a band on that bird that's going to help either promote bird conservation or help birds in general.
Yeah, I've experienced that a lot with working with trying to get birds banded recently. There's been more of a push, it seems, to have your banding tied to a specific research question rather than just putting bands out. And
part of the reason for that is lack of funding. Bands are not cheap, and the banding lab is sort of like the stepchild in the USGS. It used to be in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then it was changed to USGS when they were going to do a whole big thing back in the late 80s. And so now it doesn't get the funding that it really needs to run. It's understaffed and underfunded in a big way.
I haven't seen this here in Ohio, but when I used to live in New Jersey, I would see particularly geese with neck bands. Do you do anything with that?
I don't do neck bands, but that's usually nuisance geese. They put those neck bands on there to tell them whether they're coming back.
Gotcha. Okay. That's the same question. Can we enter your email address?
It's got a thing. It says, do you recommend banding certification courses in addition? Banding certification courses are always a plus because you're going to get hands-on work in a short period of time. But I think the volunteer hours will carry it out over a longer period of time, and the more situations that you see and see birds extracted from those situations, the better the bander or the extractor you're going to become. If you go to a one-week session, you're not going to see very much, and you're going to be taking out a few simple birds and then move on, and then all of a sudden you might get caught in a situation where you've got a downy woodpecker that's all tangled up, rolled in the net, and its tongue is caught. And it takes a lot of time and patience to get a bird out like that, especially if you don't know what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So you need to see that stuff actually happening.
Absolutely. Oh, okay. I missed a question here. Thanks, Bethany. What is your bird mortality due to banding? Have you noticed any problems due to birds being in the hands due to being stuck in vegetation, causing? Oops, sorry about that.
Our net lanes are wide enough so that rarely happens. Last year at Springville Marsh, we handled 2,200 birds, and we had 7 mortalities. Of the 7, 5 were due to predators, weasel and red squirrel. So now we've instituted a new protocol. So if we see that weasel, and she's been around for years, rather than wait for something to happen, if she's in the area of a net, that net gets closed. And we wait till she gets the young and gets out of the area. The same with a red squirrel. We had a problem with a red squirrel at the end of last year, and Sunday morning it was raped by net 1, and so the assistants ran down, closed net 1, and red squirrel was gone. And we'll have to keep an eye on it this week when we go back. So we rarely get birds injured by being in vegetation because if you look on the boardwalk, it's probably 6 feet wide there, and there's almost no way for a net to get that far over to get caught in the vegetation. And when I go onto the islands, I mow my lanes and trim them all so they are wide.
What is your favorite bird to band?
I can tell you it's not a cardinal.
They're mean. They bite hard.
You look at the cardinal in your feeder, it takes a kernel of corn and it just crushes it like nothing. It does the same thing with your cuticle. So I don't think I have a favorite bird. I mean, you always like to get something that's unusual or something different. Some birds are real soft. You like to having those around. No favorite bird. Birds are they're neat, all of them, and they all have a different story. So.
Before we forget, I do want to post your email address so that people can email you in case they're interested in visiting. Would you be able to tell me your email address?
No, it's secret.
Secret.
You're going to type it in now?
Type it in so everyone can see it.
H. Thomas. Dot.
I spelled it wrong.
No, you did it right.
Did I? Okay.
Yeah. Bartlett, Bartlett, at gmail.com.
Okay, so there's the email address for everyone to see, and Tom was generous enough to share that, so I'm sure he would also be open to any additional questions you might think of that come up here after the webinar. But he mentioned all the different banding that he'll be doing. So feel free to contact him if you know you'll be in the area or if you want to plan a trip. What kind of species are you getting now in your nets? You mentioned you were just out recently.
We had 77 birds. 32 were American tree sparrows. 13 were juncos. We had a fox sparrow. We had 5 song sparrows, 5 white-throated sparrows. We had 13 cardinals. We had a couple brown creepers. So it's mainly sparrows for the next couple of weeks. And about mid-April, the warblers start to come through. About the second week of May, then the warblers take over, and you get a lot of colorful birds.
Where is Spring Marsh? That's a good question.
Springville Marsh. It is northwest Ohio. If you look at, it's a state nature preserve. So if you go to the Division of Natural Areas and Preserves at the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, you'll find a link to it there, and they'll give you a map. But it's in Seneca County, which is up near Findlay, Cary, Tiffin area of northwest Ohio. It's about an hour south of Toledo.
All right, great.
You won't get wet when you get there. It's all boardwalk.
Perfect. Okay, thank you again for joining us. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, again, feel free to email Tom or email me, and I'll get it to make sure that Tom gets it. But thanks for joining us, and I hope to see you again on an upcoming webinar.